They laughed when she said dessert didn't need eggs, butter, or cream, just water, sugar, and hope. But when the wheat failed and every pantry turned hollow, it was her water pie that reminded the town what comfort tasted like. Before we begin, share where you're listening from, and if stories of quiet resilience stir something in you, subscribe for tomorrow's tale from the heartland. The flour was down to its final scoop, and the sugar tin echoed when shaken. Outside, the wind carried dust like a slow funeral procession past the kitchen window. Mabel Reinhardt stood at the worn oak counter, hands cracked from scrubbing and canning, eyes trained on the small inventory she had left. Half a stick of lard, a chipped tin mug with a splash of milk, and water from the well. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. The men had stopped asking for sweets by then. Dessert had become something you remembered, not something you made. But tonight, with the radio silent and the children too tired to cry for more, Mabel wanted to give her family something to look forward to, even if it was made with nothing. She stirred the water slowly, dissolving what little sugar she had into it. No eggs, no fruit, just a whisper of vanilla. The last drop scraped from the bottle and flicked in like a prayer. She poured the mixture into a pie crust she had pressed from flour and hot water, her fingers pinching the edge with the same care she gave to quilts and Sunday dresses. This wasn't just dessert, it was defiance. The recipe had come from her mother, passed down during the Panic of '93 when folks had survived on cornmeal and boiled beans. Water pie, they'd called it back then. A joke. A way of saying there was nothing left but you still had pride. Mabel never thought she'd have to use it herself. When she'd first mentioned it at the church social, folks had snorted. Clara Baines had said, "What's next, a dirt sandwich?" and the men chuckled behind their hands. But that was months ago, when there was still molasses in the stores, and the trains brought sacks of flour every week. That was before the wheat failed for the third year in a row. Before the dust storms took the hens and the garden alike, Mabel slid the pie into the oven, stoked the fire low with corn stalks and dry twigs. The stove hissed as it lit. The scent of sugar thin, but warm, began to fill the kitchen like a memory crawling back into the room. In the parlor, her youngest, Eli, coughed in his sleep. Her husband, Roy, sat with his boots off, staring into nothing, fingers absently turning his hat in his lap. They hadn't touched their ration books in weeks. They knew the stores were empty. Mabel wiped her hands on her apron, the same one she'd worn since her wedding. The timer was the rhythm in her chest, counting the minutes, the years, the prayers. Outside, the wind pressed against the windows. Inside, something sweet was still possible. The next morning, there was a half-inch of dust on the windowsill and an empty pie tin in the sink. Roy had said nothing when she served it the night before, just blinked, picked up his fork, and took a bite like it was any other Thursday. But Mabel had watched him chew slower than usual, eyes softening just a little. Eli had licked his plate, then asked if there was more. There wasn't, but she gave him the last crust off her own. Word got out faster than she expected. By Sunday, 2 women from the sewing circle showed up on her porch, scarves over their mouths and sun in their eyes. "Heard you made pie," said Mrs. Baines, not quite meeting Mabel's eyes. The same woman who had mocked her weeks before now stood twisting her gloves with nervous fingers. "That recipe," she added, "any chance you'd share it?" Mabel said nothing at first, just stepped aside and motioned toward the kitchen. She laid out the cup of flour, the scoop of sugar, the same cracked mug she'd used. No sermon, no judgment, just hands moving the way they always had, steady, capable, quiet. The women watched, they asked questions, whispered at first. "No eggs? Just water?" Mabel nodded. "You boil the water, stir the sugar, pour it slow into the crust. Don't let it slosh or it won't set right. The details mattered. The care was the point. You couldn't rush a thing like this and expect it to hold together." By that afternoon, 5 more women came. By Wednesday, the schoolteacher asked if Mabel might write it down for the bulletin board. That week's sermon was about endurance, and Pastor Hill said nothing captured it better than a pie made of nothing that still felt like love. The recipe spread like a weed, rooted in desperation, blooming in ovens where no apples grew and butter had vanished months ago. Water pie was no longer a joke. It was a miracle passed hand to hand. The men never said much, but they ate every slice. By the end of the month, the general store had sold out of sugar what little was left. Some women tried molasses or honey. One family used sorghum. They all said the same thing. It wasn't about the taste. It was about the warmth. Something sweet in a bitter season. A dessert made not from ingredients but from intent. Mabel started making 2 pies at a time, one for her family, one for someone who had none. She'd leave them on porches wrapped in dish towels, unspoken kindness in a crusted tin. The town never thanked her, not directly, but come Sunday, when she walked to church, heads nodded. Hats tipped. She had done something most couldn't explain, reminded them of normalcy, stitched from scraps, and the wind kept blowing. By early spring, Mabel had baked 47 water pies. She kept count quietly, scratching a mark into the inside of the pie, safe with the tip of a hairpin. Each notch was small, almost hidden, but to her, they were notches of dignity preserved. People in town had begun returning her empty tins with a ribbon or a note tucked inside. One child returned it with a single wildflower and the words, "It made my mama smile." That one made Mabel cry. Dust still ruled the days, and the wind still whispered ruin through the cracks in the siding. But a new kind of economy was forming, one not built on dollars or government rations, but on crusts and kindness. The women began trading flour for sugar, lard for time at someone's oven. The pie recipe became a pact. If you made one, you shared one. If you were too tired to make your own, someone would leave one at your door. It was unspoken, but as binding as any promise. Mabel noticed small changes as it took hold. Children began lingering outside longer, despite the grit in the air. A neighbor fixed the broken hinge on her screen door without being asked. The church bell rang for Sunday service again, not because attendance had soared, but because Reverend Hill said, "The sound reminds us we're still here." That spring, her husband Roy began spending more time by the stove. He'd never been much for kitchen work, hands too calloused, mind too burdened, but one evening he stood beside her and said, "Teach me." She looked up from the pie crust, surprised. "You? I figure if water and sugar can hold a town together, a man ought to know how it's done." So she did. They stood side by side, elbows brushing, as he fumbled with the measurements. He poured too fast the first time, sloshed it over the edge. She didn't scold him, just handed him a rag and said, "Again." The second pie held better, the third set like jelly. He grinned when Eli called it the best one yet. That night, Mabel felt a different kind of full. Not the fullness of food, there was still barely enough for supper, but the fullness of a home that hadn't given up. Not yet. On her walk to the well the next morning, she noticed 6 other pies cooling on porches. Some were in rusted tins, some in casserole dishes, some in chipped enamel pans. It didn't matter, they were offerings. Quiet declarations that someone still believed sweetness was possible. At the schoolhouse, the children recited spelling words between dust storms. One word was hope. Eli spelled it right. And when the teacher asked him to use it in a sentence, he said, without hesitation, "Hope is when Mama makes pie, even when there's nothing in the kitchen." The men in suits arrived 2 weeks after the sand took the northern fence line. They came in shiny automobiles that stalled twice trying to make it through the dry creek bed, kicking up clouds of dust that followed them into town like ghosts. Their hats were clean, their boots polished, and their voices clipped and official. They said they were from the Department of Agriculture, and they were there to assess conditions. The town didn't need assessment, they needed rain, but Mabel offered them pie anyway. She didn't ask permission, just brought the tin to the Nosa church basement where the officials had set up a card table and maps. The air smelled of paper and dry sweat and desperation. She placed the pie in front of them, said nothing, and left a stack of handwritten copies of her recipe beside it. Roy said she was wasting food. The men probably wouldn't eat it. And even if they did, what good was pie to Washington? She shrugged. Let them taste what survival looks like. The next morning, one of the men knocked on her door. He had the look of someone who hadn't eaten much since leaving the city, drawn cheeks, tired eyes, a hunger that went deeper than food. He held the recipe in his hand. "Did you really make this with water?" Mabel nodded. Water, sugar, flour, and a bit of stubborn. He chuckled, then turned serious. We've seen 100 towns in the past month. I've never seen anything like this. He gestured vaguely toward the road. Folks here, they're still kind. Mabel leaned on the doorframe. Kindness costs less than wheat. We got more of it. That week, the government men held a meeting in the schoolhouse. They spoke of soil conservation, of emergency shipments, of loans and seed banks. It all sounded far away, wrapped in red tape and uncertainty. But one thing was different. They listened. They asked what people needed. They asked Mabel to speak. She didn't want to. Public speaking wasn't her gift. But Roy nudged her forward. She stood on that dusty wood floor, looked out at the faces she saw every day, and said, "We can't wait for the rains. Or for Washington. We make do. We share. We show up with what we've got, even if it's just a pie made of water. It ain't about filling your belly. It's about reminding you it still matters to try." There was no applause. Just nods. Quiet understanding. When the meeting ended, 2 women left with extra copies of her recipe. A third asked if she'd teach a baking class at the church. That night, Mabel didn't bake. She sat on the porch with Roy, watching the moon rise behind the dust clouds, arms resting easy on her lap. "I think something's shifting," she said. Roy looked out at the silent road. "Maybe it's us." The rains came in late July. It wasn't a thunderous, heaven-cracking downpour like the preachers had prayed for. It came quietly, first as a scent, then a hush in the wind, then a soft tapping on the tin roof. The earth drank every drop like it had forgotten what wetness felt like. And when the sky cleared, the dust lay flat for the first time in years. Children danced in it. Grown men stood in their yards just to feel the mud rise around their boots. Mabel Reinhardt didn't cry. She simply opened her kitchen window, placed both hands on the sill, and whispered, "Thank you." But she kept making the pies. By then, people had the means to bake proper desserts again. The general store carried cocoa, condensed milk, even dried fruit if you asked Mr. Barlow nicely. But folks didn't ask for chocolate cake or peach cobbler. They asked for Mabel's pie. The name stuck. No one called it water pie anymore. That name belonged to the hard times, to hollow bellies and government bread lines. But Mabel's pie, that was something else. It was a memory you could serve with a coffee and a nod, a dessert made from endurance, a slice of proof that a person could have nothing and still give everything. One Saturday morning, 2 schoolgirls knocked on Mabel's door. They held a notepad and looked nervous. "We're writing a project," one said, "about Dust Bowl survival. Our teacher says your pie saved people." Mabel laughed softly and invited them in. She laid out the ingredients on the table. Water, sugar, a spoon of flour, the same rusted tin cup she'd used since Eli was born. "I didn't save anyone," she said, "but I reminded them we weren't dead yet." The girls wrote it down word for word. When a food writer from Oklahoma City came through town, he asked for her secret. Mabel had none to offer. "Just make it like you care who's eating it," she said. "That's more than most folks remember to do." Years passed. Eli grew tall, left for a time, then came back to open a bakery 2 towns over. He called it Stubborn Pie. Not everyone understood the name, but those who did never forgot it. He hung a framed copy of his mother's recipe on the wall behind the counter. Not typed, handwritten. The same one she'd penned 100 times for strangers during the lean years. Mabel grew older but never frail. Her hands remained steady, her mind sharp. She taught young brides how to crimp crusts. She taught widowers how to boil syrup when grief made them forget how to feed themselves. When she passed peacefully, in the kitchen, apron still tied around her waist, the town didn't mourn with fanfare. They mourned with pies. That Sunday, every table in the church basement bore one. Some were perfect, some lopsided, some had too much flour, others barely set at all. But each one was made by someone who remembered. At her funeral, Reverend Hill said, "There are people who build buildings, and there are people who build belief." Mabel built something you couldn't see until you sat at her table. Later, Roy tucked the original recipe into her apron pocket before they laid her to rest. "I figured she'd want it close," he said, voice hoarse. "She always said it wasn't magic, but it felt like it. And that was the truth of it. It wasn't the pie itself. It was what it meant when someone made one. It meant you hadn't given up. It meant you still believed someone deserved something sweet, even now. Especially now. The taste wasn't in the sugar. It was in the hands that stirred it, and that taste that stayed,